Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I've listened very carefully to my good friend from Texas, and we've worked together on many pieces of legislation over the years. In fact, I had hoped that we could have gotten this trafficking bill up during the last Congress, as he knows. And unfortunately, there were objections raised. We couldn't. I hope we're not going to get into a question where we compare apples with oranges and forget what we're supposed to be doing. Now, the distinguished senator says on the one hand that during the debate on the Affordable Care Act, according to him, and I'll take him at his word, that this language was in there and every Democrat voted for it, which meant, of course, that every Republican voted against it. If you're going to use, and if you're going to follow his argument that the language in the Affordable Care Act was voted for by Democrats, is voted against by Republicans. I'm not suggesting that they don't care about the Hyde Amendment or something else because they voted against it, according to the senator from Texas. But let's have it on the things we should be on, appropriations bills. I'm one of the few members of either party in this body who's actually prosecuted child molesters. I'm one of the few members in this body who's actually gone to crime scenes and seen the results of child molesters. I'm one of the few people in this body who's prosecuted a child molester not from evidence from the child, because the child was dead. The young boy had been raped by the man whom I prosecuted and molested over a long period of time. So I don't need to have people tell me about the horrors of child molestation. I've seen it. I remember being in the room and looking at that dead child, the same age as one of my children. And I remember the man who did it, who would have done anything to escape my prosecution. And I worked day and night around the clock for weeks. I was a young prosecutor in my 20s, and I prosecuted him and convicted him. He went up appeal to the Supreme Court, our Supreme Court, and I argued that appeal myself, and his conviction was upheld. So I know the need for this. Let's not let political gotcha games stop us from legislation that might protect these people. Now, the senator from Texas suggests I want more money. That's not quite exactly what I said. He said that he wanted $30 million in here based on fines. I said I just want to guarantee the $30 million was there. So I think, again, of that child molester, that child murderer, and I use that as just one of the many cases I prosecuted. We could have fined him $1 million, or $20 million, or $1 billion, or $200. And he would not have been able to pay it, and wouldn't have paid it. If the victim had lived, there'd be no money for it. All I want to make sure, I'm happy to see if there are fines collected that go in here to help victims. It should. But if no money is collected from fines, I want to make sure there is money. We'll prosecute somebody who's been involved with child trafficking or child molestation. We'll prosecute them, as we should. They'll go to prison. We'll spend $25,000 to $35,000 a year, taxpayers' dollars, to keep them in prison, and we should. But we'll say to the victim, I'm sorry, we fined him $100,000 to go to the victim's fund, but it's basically judgment proof. I just want you to know we had good intentions. If he had paid the $100,000 fine, we would have given it to you to help you, but gosh, go in peace, have a good life. All I'm saying is that if there is money from fines, sure, the senator from Texas and I agree on that. Put it in there. But if there's no funds, don't promise a $30 million pot of money that will never be filled. If there are no fines, if there's no money in it, or if there is fine money, put the fine money in. But where it misses between what amount is in there and the 30 million, then shouldn't we have in a country that spends trillions of dollars, shouldn't we be able to put the difference between the fines and the actual 30 million? Shouldn't we care about these victims? Shouldn't we care about the people that are victimized? And shouldn't we also do this? If we have the money in there, we can take steps to stop them from being victims in the first place. How I would have given anything. There'd been some program, some money that found out that this child I talked about was being victimized, and we could have stopped it before the state's attorney gets called in to look at the dead body. How much better it would have been if we could have stopped it to begin with. So all I'm saying is this. I'm happy to work with the senior senator from Texas on this bill, just as I was last year when he had a bill without this provision, and I was hoping and trying to get consent to bring it up and pass it when we had that bill without this provision. And it's important to note, though, if it didn't have the provision last year, I wish we could have passed it. Now, let's work on a bill that passed. If you want to play score political points, either party against the other, do it on something that doesn't involve vulnerable children. Let's work together to get a bill passed that helps them. And let's make sure that on the point I raised, that we address this at some point. If there's going to be $30 million worth of fines and they go in there, I'm all for it. My guess would be lucky to get $30,000 nationwide, those fines, which won't have more than one or two victims. In fact, when this came up in the House of Representatives, they rejected this method of funding. They called it budgetary gimmickry. But actually they did, the House did, they did what authorizing bills and committees are supposed to do. They authorized actual funding so we can stand with the victims of human trafficking and not stand here trying to score political points. In other words, let's have the money. Let's say the money is there. Don't give an illusory thing. I mean, this is like saying, if you commit that crime, we're going to fine you $100 million, or maybe $300 million, or $1 billion. If the person has a net worth or will never have more than net worth of $1,000, what difference does it make? Put real teeth in here, stop the traffickers, but have money to help the victims. Have money to help the victims. The testimony we heard, the distinguished presiding officer was one who testified. Others who testified. This had to tear people apart. The distinguished presiding officer was Attorney General for her state. She understands the reality of this, just as I do and others. Now, it's been years since I was state's attorney, but I say to my friend from Texas, I still wake up some nights with nightmares from the crime scenes I went to. I wake up from those as I sit here at the Violence Against Women Act debate, and I'm glad that Republicans and Democrats joined together on that, both here and the other body, so we could pass it. A victim is a victim is a victim. It's not a number, it's not a concept. And those of us who spend time with victims, or those of us who've been at crime scenes were victims, and too often victims could no longer speak, no longer testify. They were there for their funeral. We can do better. So let's not talk about who scores points or who doesn't score points. There are good people that worked on this. Good people in both parties. we're not going to be voting on something tonight, I imagine. But let's spend the time between now and tomorrow. Let's sit down and try to work out a way, save the political points for something where the most vulnerable in society don't suffer. We can talk about what we'll do on stock frauds or who gets taxed for what, or what regulations we'll have on runaway corporations. And all there, raise your points. Make whatever points you want. But, Madam President, anyone who has seen, anyone who's talked with, anyone who's been with these victims, this is not the time for politics. This is the time, let's lower the rhetoric. Let's get together this evening, tomorrow. Let's work it out so we can have something that will really protect them. That will have real funding in here to protect them. Not something illusory, but real funding. And maybe if we can do that, I might have less nightmares about some of those victims I saw. My friend from Texas was a judge. He certainly saw those cases. Deciding officer, the Attorney General, she saw those. We have a number of former prosecutors in both sides here. Any one of us who have handled these cases have to remember every single aspect of it. I remember preparing for trial in these cases, young children at home. I worked late in the office, I wouldn't bring the material home at all because I didn't want them to see what I was looking at. I'll admit there's another reason. I didn't want my children to see their father cry. As I read these police investigations, these aren't statistics, these are real people. Let's work together. I yield the floor to Jesse Quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.